Picture a man kneeling in a dead creek in a dry Idaho canyon, pounding wooden posts into cracked mud and weaving willow branches between them. He is building a dam by hand, a fake beaver dam made of sticks. Below him, his cattle are thirsty because this creek quits every June, the way it has his whole life. He has tried fixing it before. He released real beavers here on his own dime more than once. They died, or something ate them, and the water kept leaving. So why would a simple pile of sticks succeed where living animals failed? The man kneeling in the mud is named Wilde. He runs cattle near Preston in the southeast corner of Idaho on ground his parents farmed before him. He grew up on this creek, Birch Creek, and he can remember, as a boy, when it ran later into the season than it does now. By the time the ranch was his, the creek had developed a cruel habit. Every June, right when the heat came and the cows needed it most, the water quit. The channel went to cracked mud and stone. His cattle stood thirsty in the afternoons. For a long time, Jay did the practical thing. He worked with the Natural Resources Conservation Service and piped water into tanks so his cows could drink through the dry months. Problem solved. He could have stopped there. Most people would have. The thirst was handled, the ranch ran, and a creek that dies in June was just the way things were. But it nagged at him. He kept looking at that dead channel and thinking it was wrong. Not inconvenient. Wrong. As he put it later, he couldn't just throw up his hands and walk away from all the life that depended on that water, so he started asking a question almost nobody around him was asking. Not, how do I get water to my cows? He had that. The question was, why doesn't this creek hold water anymore? Here is the answer that took him years to understand. The creek did not need more rain. It needed a way to stop losing the rain it already had. That sounds like wordplay. It isn't. Think of a healthy mountain valley as a giant sponge. Snow melts in spring, and instead of racing straight down the channel and out of the canyon in a few fast weeks, the water gets slowed, spread sideways across the valley floor, and soaked into the ground. Then all summer long, that soaked-in water leaks back out slowly and keeps the creek alive. Birch Creek had stopped being a sponge. It had become a drain. The spring melt came, roared through a deep, narrow channel, and was gone by June. The water wasn't missing, it was leaving too fast. Something had made that valley into a sponge in the first place, and something had been removed. Beavers. Go back a couple of centuries, before the fur trade swept the American West. Beavers were everywhere, by the millions, and every one of them was in the business of slowing water down. They built dams. Dams backed up ponds. Ponds spread water into the soil and raised the water table. A stream full of beaver dams doesn't run off in a hurry, it stalls, spreads, and seeps. Then trappers came through and took the beavers out, valley by valley, for hats. The animals vanished, and the water followed them out. And it wasn't just the old trappers. Long after the fur trade faded, beavers kept getting treated as a problem to eliminate. Their dams were dynamited or torn out because managers were sure they blocked fish. Nuisance animals were trapped and killed by the thousands every year. We spent generations and real money fighting the beaver, often in the name of saving the very fish it turned out to help. The worker didn't just get fired, it got hunted. Here's the part that matters. Nobody alive remembered any of this. Generations grew up looking at a fast, narrow, June-dry creek and called it normal. It wasn't normal. It was a damaged version of a system that used to work, and the damage was so old that the memory of the working version was gone. People weren't just looking at a decline. They were looking at something broken so long ago they'd forgotten it was ever whole. Jay figured out the beaver part on his own, and he tried to fix it the obvious way. He got beavers and he put them in his creek. On his own dime, more than once. It failed every time the beavers disappeared. They didn't stay, he said. Maybe they died, maybe predators got them. He couldn't say for sure. All he knew was that he'd dropped these animals into Birch Creek and they'd be gone, and the creek stayed dead. He admitted, plainly, that it became obvious he didn't know what he was doing when it came to restoring Beaver. Now, if you're watching neighbors mock the idea, this looks like proof. The rancher tried to fix his creek with rodents, and the rodents died. Case closed. Beavers don't work. Except that failure wasn't proof the idea was stupid. It was the single most important clue in the whole story, because it revealed the trap. Here's the trap. A beaver needs deep water to survive. Deep water is where it hides from coyotes and mountain lions, where it stashes food, where it makes it through winter under the ice. Without deep water, a beaver is exposed and dead in short order. So how does a beaver get deep water? It builds a dam. And what do you need in order to build and maintain that dam? A living beaver working every day. Read that again. The beaver needs deep water to survive. Deep water requires a dam. The dam requires a surviving beaver. Drop a lone beaver into a shallow, drained creek with no pond to hide in, and it dies before it can ever build the thing that would have saved it. The solution needed the exact condition it was supposed to create. That is why Jay's beavers kept vanishing. He wasn't wrong about beavers. He was dropping them into a trap. It's such a simple trap that it's almost funny, except it had quietly defeated well-meaning people for decades. If you don't know the loop is there, every failed release just looks like more evidence that beavers are hopeless. The failures weren't random bad luck. They were the same wall, hit over and over. In 2014, he came across an article about two scientists at Utah State University, Joe Wheaton, a watershed professor, and his colleague Nick Bouwes, who had figured out how to break that trap. Their method sounds almost too simple to take seriously. Before you release a single beaver, you build fake beaver dams first. They are called beaver dam analogs. The recipe is humble to the point of looking ridiculous. You drive a row of wooden posts into the stream bed. You weave willow branches and brush between them. That's basically it. It's a speed bump for water, built by people, standing in for the animal. It's not meant to be permanent, and it's not meant to do the whole job. It's meant to do one thing: create a patch of slower, deeper, ponded water where a beaver can actually survive long enough to take over. The scientists weren't trying to rebuild the creek. They were trying to give nature a head start. And once that first patch of deep water exists, something clicks. The beaver has a safe place to work from. It starts hauling mud and sticks onto the human-made posts, sealing the leaks, raising the dam higher. What began as a leaky stick fence becomes a real, watertight beaver dam. The pond behind it grows. More of the valley floor goes underwater, then soaks through. The animal isn't fighting the creek, it's plugging it, slowing it, and turning a fast drain back into a slow sponge, exactly the thing that had been missing for 100 years. So in the fall of 2015, Jay Wilde and a crew from Utah State went to work in Birch Creek. They built 19 of these stick-and-post structures. The materials came from a Forest Service grant of about $3,000. $3,000. In sticks. His wife and family pitched in, driving posts by hand in the cold. The following year, they added 15 more, and a workshop run by the Natural Resources Conservation Service brought around 40 agency biologists and engineers out to the site to learn the technique. Then came the beavers. A conservation officer with Idaho Fish and Game named Raleigh Scott live-trapped a family of nuisance beavers from somewhere they were not wanted and moved them into Birch Creek. 5 of them. The fake dams gave the animals something they had never had in Jay's earlier attempts: instant deep water, a safe place to start. Wheaton described the thinking with a grin. They wanted to give the beavers choices, upstream and downstream, so the animals would not feel boxed in and bolt like nervous teenagers. Then everyone left, and they waited through the winter to see if a single beaver was still alive under the ice. You already suspect how this goes, but the details are better than the summary. They lived. The beavers made it through the winter. They built a lodge, they built a primary dam and a string of smaller ones below it. And then, they did the thing no human crew could do cheaply. They kept building on their own for free every single day without a grant or a permit or a paycheck. They had babies. The babies built dams. Those dams backed up more water, which made room for more beavers, which built more dams. If you walked that canyon now, you would not recognize it. Where there had been a single thin thread of water cutting through dry grass, there were now stacked ponds, wet meadows, side channels, and strips of green spreading out from the water's edge. The change did not stay around the posts the humans had driven. It climbed up and down the valley, following the beavers wherever they decided to build next. Willows thickened. Birds came back. The ground itself, which used to crack in the heat, stayed soft and damp. A handful of people had built 34 starter structures. Within a few years, Birch Creek had 149 beaver dams. By 2020, more than 165. The humans had lit the match. The beavers built the fire, and the creek changed. At first, Jay noticed water hanging on later into the summer, a couple of extra months where the channel used to be dust, then more. Within about 4 years, monitoring showed the creek flowing roughly 42 days longer than it had before. And then, the thing he had been chasing for decades actually happened. Birch Creek started running year-round again. In the reflection he would give later, he put it simply. His goal had been to bring back perennial flow, and mission accomplished. From 2022 through 2025, the creek ran all year, every year. Now, hold on. A reasonable person has objections at this point. First, wouldn't all those dams block the fish? This is exactly what fisheries managers assumed for a century, and it's a big part of why beavers got treated as pests to be removed. If you're trying to save trout, a wall across the creek sounds like the enemy. It's the opposite. Before the beavers, Birch Creek's trout were stuck in a thin, shallow trickle with nowhere to hide and nothing to eat. The ponds changed everything. Deep water stays cooler in summer. Ponds hold more insects, more food, more cover from predators. They gave the fish room to actually live. And these weren't just any trout, they were Bonneville cutthroat, a native species of special concern. The kind of fish agencies spend real money trying to protect. So what happened to them? In the ponded stretches of the creek, the number of native trout came back 10 to 50 times higher than before the beavers returned. 10 to 50 times. Jay's granddaughter Emily, who had helped drive posts and survey fish, started pulling fat, healthy cutthroat out of ponds that, a few years earlier, had been dry gravel. She was so taken with it that she went off to Utah State to study natural resource conservation. The creek didn't just change the land, it changed the kid who grew up on it. And this wasn't Jay eyeballing his own creek and talking himself into a happy ending. Researchers from Utah State, along with people from the Forest Service, Idaho Fish and Game, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service were on the ground. Measuring, counting fish, tracking flow, mapping the growing maze of dams year after year. The creek that used to be one man's private disappointment had become a monitored, documented case study that other scientists could check. Second objection, couldn't this just be luck? One good stretch of weather, one lucky creek? That's the right question, and the answer is what turns this from a nice local story into something bigger. Because Birch Creek wasn't the only place. The same two scientists, Bouwes and Wheaton, had run a bigger, more controlled experiment on Birch Creek in Oregon, using the same low-tech dams to help a threatened run of steelhead trout. The results were published in the journal Scientific Reports in 2016. Same principle, different river, different fish, measured carefully. The cheap structures worked. This wasn't one rancher getting lucky. It was a repeatable pattern. That is why the story is believable. Since then, low-tech beaver restoration has spread across the West, onto other ranches, other watersheds, and into the playbooks of agencies that once spent their time removing the animal. What one stubborn rancher tried on a dead creek in Idaho turned into a method other people now copy on purpose. And here's where it gets stranger. Because the water and the trout were the goal, what came next, nobody had promised. An eco-hydrologist named Emily Fairfax started studying what beaver-dammed stretches of land do during wildfire. She and a colleague looked at fires across the western United States using satellite imagery, comparing the green of beaver country against the surrounding landscape as the flames came through. Their 2020 paper had a title that tells you the finding, Smokey the Beaver. Beaver-dammed corridors stayed green while everything around them burned. The reason is the same mechanism that fixed Jay's Creek. As Fairfax puts it, when it comes to water, beavers slow it, spread it, and store it. All that water pushed sideways into the soil keeps the plants lush and wet. Lush, wet plants don't burn well, so the beaver zones become green ribbons, the fire skirts around, refuges where fish, frogs, birds, and animals can survive a blaze that consumes the dry hills. Nobody set out to build a fire break in Birch Creek. By bringing back the beavers, Jay got drought resilience, flood buffering, and fire resistance thrown in for free. So is this the miracle fix for every dying creek in the West? No. And this is the part that keeps the story honest. Beavers only work where the pieces line up. You need the right kind of stream, the right slope, enough water, and food like willow and aspen for the animals to eat and build with. You need land use that can live alongside ponds. You need to place the structures carefully away from roads, culverts, and fields because a beaver dam in the wrong spot floods exactly what you didn't want flooded. Beavers don't read property maps. Drop them in the wrong place and you've traded a dry creek for a plugged culvert and an angry neighbor. This was never magic. It was leverage, a small push applied to the one load-bearing point in the system. But where the pieces do line up, the leverage is almost absurd. Think about the contrast. Agencies have spent enormous sums over the past century removing beavers as nuisances, tearing out dams that were assumed to block fish, and paying for hard engineering to manage water and rebuild streams. And here's a rancher who fixed his creek, brought back a threatened trout tenfold or more, and drought-proofed and fire-proofed a stretch of his valley with about $3,000 of posts and willow and 5 rodents that another agency was trying to get rid of. For years, people looked at that animal and saw a pest. The valley had been using it as infrastructure the whole time. Jay Wilde noticed, and he did the thing that turns one success into a movement. He started talking. He went on the road with the Utah State crew, telling his story at workshops across the American West to ranchers who came in as skeptical as he'd once been. He's told it to thousands of them now. The gruff cattleman who used to chase beavers off his land became the guy standing up in front of a room full of ranchers telling them to give beavers a shot. When he describes seeing the results, he doesn't reach for science. He says it's almost like magic. It wasn't magic, of course. We know exactly why it worked, but you can understand why it feels that way to a man who spent decades watching his creek die every June and finally watched it come back to life. There are more stories like this than you'd think, places where the cheapest, strangest-looking answer was the one everyone walked past for years. Which brings us back to the beginning, to a man kneeling in cracked mud, driving wooden posts into a dead creek, weaving willow between them, building a clumsy fake dam by hand while his neighbors wondered what he was doing. He wasn't building a creek, he was building a doorway, just enough of a foothold for the real engineer to move back in and take over the job. The water that returned to Birch Creek didn't come from a reservoir, a pipeline, or a bigger budget. It came back because a rancher finally stopped fighting the animal his ancestors had removed and let it go back to work. The solution was not bigger engineering, it was older engineering. For 100 years, people treated the beaver as the problem. The problem was that the beaver had been missing.